Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Kenji Obadia. I work as a senior clinical scientist for a biotechnology company in the Bay Area. Working in a clinical genomic lab, my job involves unlocking the power of the human genome through assay development and molecular testing for genetic disorders and cancer. As Christians, we are called to follow Christ. However, whenever I think of being called, what immediately comes to my mind is where God wants us to be able to impact lives. In a sense, a calling is something God places within us to be able to bless others. While we can find a key calling in our life, it is vital to remember that the greatest call is to know Jesus himself. I grew up in the Presbyterian Church in Cameroon, where my dad was a pastor for over 25 years. My dad was my greatest influencer and hero. I admired the number of lives he could impact through his preaching, prayer, and solidarity. My dad pastored a church with over 3,000 Christians, and he was in charge of overseeing over 150 other Presbyterian churches and pastors in Cameroon as administrator for the Northwest region. I always followed him whenever he was on his pastoral visits, and I've had the opportunity to share the pulpit with him as a preacher. As I grew older, I was very convinced that God's call for me is to become a pastor just like my dad. I quickly earned the nickname Pastor Kenji Jr. from most of my friends and family members. Everyone saw me as that person to take over for my dad. It was certain that after high school, I would enroll in the Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Cameroon to be trained as a pastor. However, upon completion of high school, I did not feel God speaking to me to become a pastor. I therefore had to open up to my dad. Instead of him being disappointed with me, he told me this: "My son, don't force it. There are many ways to fulfill God's call. Those whom God has called to become pastors know this call by a sense of leading, purpose, and growing commitment." Later that year, my friend Elvis introduced me to the various programs being offered by the School of Medicine of the University of Obadia in Cameroon. I became interested in clinical laboratory sciences. However, only one university in the entire country could offer that program at that time. The university could only accept 40 students per year through a very competitive entrance exam. My dad prayed with me, and I told God that if it is His will for me to serve Him by becoming a clinical scientist, let Him make a way for me to be selected into the clinical scientist training program. God did just that. I was among the 40 applicants selected into the clinical laboratory scientist training program for that year. After 4 years of studies, I graduated and I worked as a clinical laboratory technologist in Cameroon and in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, performing routine and complex testing on clinical samples to help diagnose and treat diseases. As ambitious as I am, I did not want to limit myself to routine clinical diagnosis of diseases. I was also interested in research that focuses on developing rapid point-of-care diagnostic assays that aid in the diagnosis and treatment of diseases. I was therefore interested in continuing my graduate studies in the United States. However, I had to move to Dubai because the pay there was better. For this will enable me to save enough money towards my tuition and move to the United States for my graduate studies. After working in Dubai for 2 years, my dad was assassinated in Cameroon. And I had to move back to Cameroon. Being the first child in our family, the financial responsibility on me after the assassination of my dad was overwhelming. And I had to use up all of my savings to take care of my family. I was very angry with God. I asked God why He had to put such a huge responsibility on me. My dream of continuing my education in the United States was far from being a reality. But all hope was not lost because God works in ways that we cannot see. That same year, the National Institutes of Health of the United States launched a competitive scholarship program for 3 Africans, and I was selected to study biomedical sciences at the University of Obadia. My tuition was fully funded by the National Institutes of Health for 5 years, and I had the opportunity to be trained on how to develop and validate different clinical laboratory diagnostic tests. During my PhD program in Hawaii, I decided to do part of my research in Cameroon. This is because in Cameroon, whenever a patient presents with fever in the hospital, the doctors will only treat that patient for malaria, even if that patient is negative for malaria. Due to the lack of diagnostic tools, pathogens that cause other febrile illnesses are not diagnosed. Death from some of these febrile illnesses can easily be prevented if accurate diagnostic tools are made available. My research question was simple and basic: to identify the causes of fever other than malaria in febrile patients in Cameroon. As we went for hospital rounds in one of our study sites, I came across this little girl called Joan, who was being treated for malaria for the past 3 days without any improvement. After discussing with the clinical and my research team, we decided to test her for typhoid using one of the rapid diagnostic tests that I brought for my research work. Typhoid causes a fever and is caused by the pathogen Salmonella typhi. Behold, she was positive for typhoid, but was being treated for malaria. We then suggested to the clinical team to place her on antibiotics, and she was healed and discharged after 2 days. Without our intervention, she could have died because she was being treated for the wrong disease. After this incident, I thank God for using me to save the lives and improve health care of many patients through my research project. This particular incident was like the icing on the cake on what God is calling me to do. I am convinced that God's call is for me to be a clinical scientist, developing and conducting genetic, cancer, and infectious disease testing, predicting the correct antibiotic to prescribe, typing the correct blood for surgery, thereby providing answers to life and death decisions every day. Presently, I work on diagnosing genetic disorders in children before they are born. As early as 10 weeks of gestation, we are able to screen for genetic disorders in the unborn child with blood collected from the mom using our proprietary technology, which is less invasive. Although I find clinical diagnosis and assay development a key calling in my life, my greatest call is to know Jesus Himself. Thanks for listening.